recording here. All right. So my name is Mark Phillip, and I'm an application engineer with Studica Incorporated, and I'm joined by my colleague Christy Leitner, who's our director of marketing. And today we're going to be talking about the Babbel language learning software, and we'll take a look at some of the trends in language learning, some of the statistics related to bilingualism and multilingualism in the United States, and basically why Babbel is a good fit for education. Studica is an academic reseller. We have been selling hardware, software to schools, faculty, students, pretty much any realm of the education sector for a little over 30 years. And so we have quite a bit of experience, quite a lot of experience combined amongst all of our employees here. And so we're pretty excited to talk about Babbel with you today. My contact information is right here if you need to contact me for any reason. We'll also post more contact information at the end, and our website is www.studica.com. So Becky, you won't have access to the slides, but we will be recording this, so you can have access to the recording. Anyway. All right, so I want to start off kind of bullet pointing here of the importance of language learning. Basically, the upshot is that there's an increasing number of bilingual speakers in the United States. There are more and more language requirements happening at the higher education sector, and we'll look at why this is important for every education area, whether it's K through 12 or higher education. We'll take a look at globalization and how that's affecting the job market and how that's creating more demand for bilingual employees. And this last point here is a real quick footnote that I won't really discuss, but there is a health and well-being aspect to bilingualism. This has been researched quite heavily by psychologists, neuroscientists, and linguists, and essentially what's been found is people who are bilingual tend to have these traits here: better attention span, better problem-solving skills, and the ability to adapt to new information more quickly. And we've also seen cognitive benefits in elderly people in staving off the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's. So there's actually a lot of interesting research here. It's a point I just like making real quick, because instead of just focusing on jobs and the education aspect, there is that health and well-being aspect, which is, I think, another big reason people are increasingly pushing for bilingual education, on top of some of the other things we'll talk about. So if that interests you, I recommend looking into some of that research. So what this chart's shown us here is basically that there's an increasing number of bilingual speakers in the United States since 2010, and the projections show that that number is only going to keep getting larger as time goes on. We're looking at the population of 5-year-olds speaking a language other than English at home in the United States. 3 different data points between 2010, 2015, 2020. The numbers are in millions. So by 2020, we're looking at roughly 71.8 million people. That's about a fifth, some quick math in my head, a little under a fifth of the population is speaking a different language than English at home. So this is helping to drive interest in learning secondary languages, and it is creating more demand for schools to be teaching these languages as well. Basically, as people interact more with other individuals who speak multiple languages, the idea of bilingualism, the idea of learning a second language, becomes a little more enticing and becomes something more reasonable to most people when they see it being used in their everyday life. So this is these numbers are driving a lot of schools to be looking into bilingual or language learning programs in the education sector. On the topic of language requirements, what we're seeing is that approximately 50% of higher education institutions in the United States have implemented some kind of language learning requirement. That data comes from the Modern Language Association. They're basically a group that looks at all sorts of statistics related to language learning and bilingualism. And this is an interesting statistic, because basically what this means is that we can better set up students for success in higher education if we start them sooner in the K through 12 sector. And additionally, for the higher education people who might have to be implementing such programs, they need to be concerned with, what's the most effective way for me to implement some kind of language program to make sure that my students are meeting the degree requirements, right? So the big point here, though, is on K-12 schools, because study after study has basically shown that the younger you are, the more capable you are at learning a new language. And so if we can prepare kids in K through 12 to be learning a second language, especially the younger they are, I mean, we're talking second to sixth grade sort of prime time area to learn a second language, then we're going to make it simpler for students who are going into higher education to be able to meet these requirements, and it's going to make their life a little bit easier going into that realm. So this chart's basically showing us the percentage of U.S. campuses that have developed some kind of international global learning outcomes. And what's interesting with this is that we see data between 2006 and 2011. I couldn't find more recent data, but it's projected to keep increasing from what I've been reading. But across every type of degree, we actually see an increase in the 5-year difference here between the years. We've seen a pretty drastic increase across every type of degree. So this is pretty significant, especially for people going into graduate programs, such as PhD programs. Clearly, 80% of schools have some kind of learning outcome for a second language. And then your master's, bachelor's degrees, and even your associate level, 46% of campuses now have some requirement for international global learning outcome. So that's kind of the landscape of how institutions are kind of adapting to this trend of teaching more second languages, bilingualism in school. But I also want to talk about the economic aspect, I should say. So we're going to talk about globalization and how that's affecting bilingualism and the demand for bilingual workers. And for people who may not know, globalization is basically the idea of the world economy. The fact that pretty much tons of countries around the world now are doing, engaging in trade with one another. And this is largely being opened up by emerging economies that are recently industrializing and opening up their markets. And it's driving a lot of demand all around the world for all sorts of all sorts of industries, and those industries now are looking to hire people who can speak these languages in these other countries and who understand these norms, these cultural norms in those countries, to be able to, be more effective at their jobs. So we're seeing an increased number of jobs that are seeking bilingual employees. So what this chart up here is showing us is the number of online job listings for workers with bilingual skills between 2010 and 2015. And we've basically seen over a 2 times increase since 2010 for people with bilingual skills. And I think some of this can maybe be explained away with there's been a larger proliferation of online job sites since 2010. So maybe there's just more data out there since 2010. But regardless, that wouldn't account for this entire increase. The fact is we're seeing in general just a big increase in people in jobs that are looking for bilingual employees. And what we're seeing on these charts is basically that the demand for bilingual employees is actually spread across relatively evenly across different prestige of jobs. So this chart on the left is showing us the change in share of jobs targeting bilingual workers based on prestige. And prestige is basically a measure of how people perceive how prestigious a job is, right? So most people would see a neurosurgeon as a high prestige, right? Whereas a lot of people might see a fast food worker as a lower prestige job. So that's kind of how they classify this. But we're seeing that the demand is actually spread relatively evenly, and it's especially high demand in the high prestige area. And this is, I believe, related largely to banking and medicine. And we actually see kind of a correlation there on this chart on the right, which is showing the employers with the largest share of bilingual listings as of 2015. And most of these are Fortune 500 corporations. But if you kind of look at the industries, there's a lot of banks, there's a lot of insurance, there's health, and there's a lot of data carriers, T-Mobile, AT&T, things like that. These are multinational corporations that are doing tons of business, and they are increasingly looking for more and more people with bilingual skills to hire because they're doing more and more business all around the world. So basically the upshot of this is that students who are bilingual and who understand a second language or multiple languages are putting themselves in a much more advantageous position to find work. Your resume is going to look better. You're probably more likely to find an interview, and having that bilingual skill set is more likely to actually land you that job. And I believe the number I had found was that bilingual employees actually earn, on average, I think $2,000 more in salary every year. So basically, you're setting up your students for a more successful career and more job opportunities by teaching them a second language. So now we've kind of looked at that aspect, the economic, monetary aspect. Let's look at some of the trends that schools are currently using for teaching language learning. So there's blended learning, language immersion, and distance learning. So language immersion is an approach where the idea is that your student might say, I'm taking a Spanish class, right? I'm a native English speaker. I'm trying to learn Spanish. When I go to class, I'm basically expected to be speaking and listening to only Spanish in class. Even if I don't know Spanish, the teacher's there to try and help me out. But the idea is that you sit and converse with your classmates using what little Spanish you know. And the focus is much more on using the language, not memorizing it, but actually having conversations with it. This is an increasingly popular approach. It's been widely adopted in a lot of European countries who have strict language requirements, and it's been widely successful. In the United States, there's roughly 450 schools using this approach, and the graph here actually shows us the adoption since 1971, and we can see that between 2006 and 2011, we've seen a pretty large increase in schools that are using language immersion. Another thing with language immersion is there will be a heavy focus on culture and basically understanding the culture of, say, the country of origin of which the language you're trying to learn comes from, right? And that's also becoming a big focus in a lot of schools currently. With blended learning, the approach here is that you kind of have this hybrid face-to-face meeting with online coursework to supplement your face-to-face meeting. So in this approach, if I were taking a blended learning Spanish course, I might actually go to class 2 days of the week, right? And we'll maybe take a test or be evaluated on something, or maybe we'll just do normal learning. But then the rest of the time, my teacher might post assignments onto some kind of web system, whether it's like Blackboard or Canvas or whatever you use. And then I have to, do those assignments, turn them in, etc. The blended learning approach combines distance learning and face-to-face. And distance learning is the next thing I'll talk about, but basically the online learning approach is increasingly popular. Students in general tend to respond more positively to it, and most students actually report that they learn better through an online environment and that they retain the information better. Of course, that students saying that, maybe they're not entirely honest. It's hard to say, but in general, those are the stats that we do have. This approach is increasingly requested also by parents, not just students. And this is a very popular approach. And with blended learning, you can kind of use whatever approach you want in the classroom. So you could even incorporate the immersion approach when you have students come to your class face-to-face, right? So with that, we kind of look at now distance learning, which is a step removed from blended learning, where we take out the face-to-face component and we look specifically at the online component. This is a situation where the student actually does not go to class. The student basically engages the course through through some online system, right? Statistics-wise, by 2019, at least 50% of classes in college are expected to be delivered online. That's pretty massive. 50% of classes in college, half of the courses offered at a college are expected to be online on average. And in my experience with college somewhat recently, a lot of these classes are general education courses. So it is cutting down on the cost of higher education. And in general, faculty, administrators, and students all favor these courses because they save time, they save money, they save resources. And in general, the students are still getting a good education out of it. in the K through 12 sector, we're seeing a slower adoption here. And I don't know exactly why that is, but basically there's fewer K-12 public schools that are adopting distance learning. I'm assuming this is because it's harder for them to implement due to rules and regulations they have to follow. Being that they're a public entity, they have to follow the bureaucratic rules and things like that. So maybe it's just a bit slower of an adoption. But there are some schools that are implementing online programs in the K-12 sector, public schools. And, we see that with the use of, say, Chromebooks in classrooms. I go to some of these trade shows and I'll talk to a lot of people in K-12 who have Chromebook programs where their students are given like a Chromebook to take home and do coursework on. So that's a way that distance learning is being implemented now. So those are kind of the three main approaches currently for language learning that have been proven to be really effective. And so let's look at what Babbel is. Basically, Babbel is a language learning program, and it's all online. And because it's all online, it all goes through a website. There is an app for it for mobile devices such as your iPhone and your Android. And you can pretty much access it from any sort of device because it's just an online website. So as long as your device can access a website, you should be able to access Babbel. It is widely used in education currently, and they focus more on real-life conversations and not just definitions and memorization. And we'll kind of see how that looks in a moment here. It leverages your native language to basically teach you the current language. So this is not so different than going to a classroom and having the teacher say something in Spanish and then tell you what that means in English, right? So basically, you do have some guidance there in your native language to start learning the second language. Babbel also focuses on all of the skill sets of language, which is listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And there's 8,500 hours of content in 14 different languages. And what I'll do is show a quick demonstration here of kind of what Babbel looks like. So this is the main page. I'm signed into my account and I'm set up to do the Spanish courses. So I have Spanish selected. And I do want to emphasize that pretty much everything you see is going to be pretty universal for any device that you access this on. Because it's just a website, if you were to access this on your Mac, on a Linux computer, on a Chromebook, it's all going to look very similar. Even if you access the app through Android or iOS, it's going to look very similar to this. So there's no like big curve of, oh, I'm switching devices, now I don't know what I'm doing. Like if you've used it on one device, you should be able to manage and figure it out on the others. So I'm going to go courses. And in here, they're going to kind of break down different types of courses. So there's new content, basically new stuff that's been created that I can look at. Courses for beginners, grammar courses, intermediate, courses that focus on listening and speaking, cultural courses that are more focused on, say, the culture of the country, some special courses that look at things like idioms, for instance, and then words and sentences courses. So each of these kind of look into a specific area of mastery, and I'll take the beginner's course. And in here I can click, say, I have all these 6 beginner's courses. I have a green dot next to the one I left off on, so I can go beginner's course 1. And then it keeps track of where I am. Like I finished the first one, so there's a green check mark. And then I haven't done part 2, but I can look through here. Looks like there's about 20 plus little courses in here. So I can click start on the part 2 here. And it's gonna ask me if I wanna do speech recognition. I will do speech recognition just so you can kind of get an idea of how that looks, or sounds rather, and you can hear my very poor Spanish. So when I click continue, what it's going to do is basically say sentences and phrases at me, and I have to repeat those phrases back.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto. Mucho gusto.
Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. So basically what it was doing there is it's listening to my microphone, and it's basically analyzing the way I'm saying stuff and matching it with what they have on file. I do want to point out the person who's speaking, who is saying the words initially, are native speakers of the language. That is, this language is their first language, and so they do have the proper accent and pronunciation. And the microphone is actually listening for that. It's making sure that you're pronouncing as well as you can, that I'm rolling my R's as well as I can, and things like that. So it will knock you sometimes, even if you think you're saying it right, it will knock you sometimes if you're not getting those little details correct with the pronunciation. Also, we see this visual retention here, where they use the visual to associate certain phrases with this to kind of help reinforce the idea, right? So mucho gusto, which is it's a pleasure, is kind of like two people meeting each other, right? Hasta pronto, which is see you soon, is like two people shaking hands like they're leaving. Good morning, we just see a picture of this kind of morning haze over a field, right? So the idea is to kind of reinforce the visual aspect with the written and the auditory aspect. So then they go through different aspects here of matching the phrase mucho gusto with the item here. So mucho gusto is it's a pleasure.
Mucho gusto.
And then they repeat the words so that I keep reinforcing the phonetic, the pronunciation. Hasta pronto.
Hasta
See you
pronto.
soon. Buenos dias is good morning.
Buenos días.
And tardes is
Buenas
good afternoon.
tardes.
And then they have the written aspect. So how do I write it's a pleasure is going to be mucho gusto. And you can kind of see they have these letters here. This is largely for mobile users because it's very easy to tap on these on a touch screen, and it looks just like this on your phone. So if you were to access this on like your iPhone, you'd pretty much see this same setup.
Mucho gusto.
This is hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.
And we have buenos dias, and they include the little custom
Buenos
characters,
dias.
like the I there with the weird squiggly above it. I don't know what you call that. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
And they'll give you some of these hints about, you say buenas tardes starting from noon, buenas noches when it gets dark. And then they have these dialogue exchanges, which play out like a text message, right? They want you to fill in, like, how do I say good morning? So I'd say buenos dias with the squiggly I.
Buenos días, Carlos.
And then Carlos says good afternoon, Jorge. So we say buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, Jorge. Ya es mediodía.
And they also throw in some extra phrases like ya es mediodía.
Buenas tardes, Jorge.
Which is it's
Ya es
already
mediodía.
noon.
Buenas tardes, Jorge. Ya es
Whoops.
mediodía.
I keep clicking on it and keep saying it. And then we have like sí.
Sí, ya
And
es
basically
tarde.
the conversation
¿Y
goes back and
ustedes?
forth like this. And so I kind of mentioned earlier
Ella es mi
how
esposa.
Babbel is focused on like conversations, right? And this is an example of that.
Hola,
It's
yo soy Claudia.
It's something you might actually say in a conversation with somebody, instead of a lot of language learning programs will be much more focused on like,
Mucho gusto.
you
Yo
know,
soy
here's the
Jorge.
definition. Now let's just throw all the
Encantada.
definitions into a word soup basically and try to get you to memorize them. This is much more like if I actually was in Mexico or something and I was trying to talk to somebody, I can relate to this, right? Like this is an actual conversation I might have with somebody, and it's much easier for people to retain
Hasta pronto.
information when they're learning something that has some real world bearing for them.
Chao.
Yeah, so then that's the conversation part. They'll have stuff like this, talking about the feminine, masculine endings for words in the languages that have that. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing just for time purposes, but kind of all the lessons sort of follow this kind of setup, where they try to reinforce, grammar, phonetic, listening, speaking, reading, writing, all these different aspects. And the last thing I'll show is the review section. So I can go to the vocabulary tab and basically see everything I've learned up to this point based on the lessons I've gone through. It's taking a little while to load. There we go. So it shows me all these words in English, right? Like you, she, hello, thank you. And I can see the Spanish definitions. I can listen to them.
Tú, ella,
Hola, gracias.
I can kind of put my own knowledge level on how I feel about these words. And I can also review them. So I can choose review these items. And I can review like the written aspect. I can do a memorization approach with flashcards, or I can review using speaking. So for instance, I'll do flashcards. Maybe I got a test coming up and I just really need to retain information. So hello is going to be hola. So
Hola.
click here. Ask me if I got it right. I say yes. Yes is sí.
Sí.
Thank you is gracias.
Gracias.
Bye is ciao.
Chao.
I is yo.
Yo.
You is tú.
Tú.
He is él.
Él.
Él. She is ella.
Ella.
And again, they say the word again, right? So you can keep trying to reinforce the pronunciation. Like I always have trouble saying ella. The way they say it is quite a bit different than the way I say it. But that's something that I might, note for myself is like work on my pronunciation for these specific words. So yeah, the vocabulary section is basically just a review section for you. Everything you've learned will go into here, and you can kind of basically work towards your weaknesses, right? Find the stuff you don't feel good about and reinforce that learning. So that's kind of the broad overview. There's a lot more to look into with Babbel, but I don't want to take a whole lot of time on this, but that's kind of the general idea. So we kind of looked at the pathways to mastery. Basically, the courses are laid out into like beginner sections, intermediate sections. There's even stuff for advanced, maybe even native speakers, like grammar sections, right? Grammar is often one of the harder parts of language, even for people who natively speak a language. And so you can take grammar courses, maybe refine your grammar a bit more. And again, I also mentioned that there's a countries and traditions section on some of the language courses, and that helps reinforce the whole cultural learning aspect. So Babbel's effective kind of for a lot of the reasons I've talked about. The dialogue is more interactive, such as having a real conversation instead of just throwing together definitions into a sentence and expecting you to decipher it. The lessons are voiced by native speakers, so you actually get proper pronunciation and accents, and you can try and mimic that as best as you can. And the speech recognition technology is used to reinforce that pronunciation. You have review sessions using that vocabulary section so that you can reinforce your learning. And the lessons are only about 10 to 15 minutes, which is really nice for busy schedules, and it's actually ideal for learning a language. A lot of research has shown that you only really need to study a language about 30 to 40 minutes in a given day to really actually become proficient in the language given enough time. So really 2 to 3 lessons in a day is enough for you to really effectively learn a language rather quickly. So splitting the lessons down into 10-15 minute sessions is actually a great idea. The content is relevant, so like I said, you're having an actual conversation, and the program is highly portable, meaning it's available anytime, anywhere. And like I said, if you have an internet connection, if you can access a website, you can reach Babbel, you can use it. You can get it on your device, your mobile devices, your Chromebook, your Linux, your Mac, your PC, whatever, which is great because in school, you might have students with a wide variety of devices. You might have students that don't even have a PC at home. They only have a mobile device. Well, that's fine. They can still use the software and do lessons. So why do educators choose Babbel? Well, it's easy to use, it is affordable, and it's always available, and it's highly portable. Like I just mentioned, this is a really big thing for students because plenty of students have conflicting devices, so having a software solution that is not really platform specific is actually a really big benefit there. Basically, you can practically be guaranteed that your students have some kind of hardware that is going to work with this program. And all that progress is synced among the devices. So if the students at school using like the library PC to do a lesson, and they go home and they get on their iPhone or their Android and they go back to the lesson, where they left off will be synced on their account, so they can just pick up where they were at. Babbel is great for the current learning trends, and so you can basically use this in an immersive environment, a blended learning environment, or an online environment, especially blended learning and distance learning, because you have to have some way of basically measuring student success and progress and giving them coursework and homework. And a great way to do that is through language programs like this. In the immersive environment, there's actually cultural courses here, which is a great thing for the immersive approach where culture and understanding that culture is a big emphasis. And it's also a great way to ensure that your students, when they go home, they're still engaging in the language, right? So one note I added here about 2 months ago is that there's a license management system that's currently in beta that Babbel is working very quickly to basically finalize. But the idea with this is that there's a centralized solution for licensing. This uses an invitation system instead of license codes, so that your license manager basically sends invites out to students, for instance, and they can access it, and then they have access to Babbel. You can keep track of the invitations and who the current users are. Again, this is beta stages, but Babbel has told us it's available upon request. So we do know that license management is usually a big deal at schools where you have some kind of IT department that has a centralized management system. And this is basically a solution for that for Babbel. Again, this is beta and it's continuously being improved and developed, but it is available upon request if that's something you need. So for attending the webinar, we are giving a free personal copy of Babbel to people in attendance. Basically, to do this, look at the red text down here on my screen, email marketing@studica.com and put Bab free, all caps, as your subject line. And basically, we'll get back to you with instructions on how you get a free 6-month personal license. So the 6-month personal license is basically a fully featured license of Babbel that you can use for 6 months. And the idea here is that you can test it out, see if it works for you, and if you think it's going to work well for your classroom and for your needs. And so again, just email marketing@studica.com, use Bab free as the subject line, and we'll send you instructions on how you can get that free 6-month personal license. And that's only for those of you in attendance. So I'll leave that up for about 20 seconds or so. Okay. So at that point, I'll open it to questions. And it looks like Becky just asked what kind of data is available through the license management system. So currently, from what I've seen, it's basically who has a license, like how many licenses you have, what's been checked out, things specifically related to the license itself. For student progress, from what I've heard, I believe Frank had mentioned that that is something that's being worked on. I don't know specifics about it though, and I don't want to give you the wrong information. So, yeah, some of those features are in the works currently. The license management system, from what I've seen and used, is basically related to licenses specifically and who's using them and what's available. But tracking progress, I believe, is in the works. If you need a beta tester, let me know. Well, I don't know. That's something Christy might be able to, attest to better. I don't know if we can. I'm pretty sure all the beta testing is happening at Babbel specifically. I'm not sure we have any sway over that. So yeah, if you have any other questions, do let me know. I'll leave it open for about a minute, let you think on some questions you might have. Can you provide the invitations for purchase in our bookstore, or is there another way that colleges are using this? That's an interesting question. I don't have a clear answer for that at the moment. That's definitely something I think, Christy, we'd probably want to ask Frank about, because he could probably talk to Babbel about it. Yeah, because I don't know how Babbel is about like reselling out their license from the system. So yeah, that's probably something we could look into more and get back to you about, and maybe give you a more definitive answer there. Yeah, and thank you for attending. Do you have any other questions at the moment? Last thing is just this slide, which is basically a bunch of information for contacting us if you need to. If you want to talk to somebody in the sales department, maybe about pricing or any more specific questions, you can contact sales@studica.com. Our sales reps often have more information than I do about some of these specifics, so that can be a really good resource if you do have those questions. Also, you can contact us, 888-561-7521. We're available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you'll also get a follow-up email that will contain a recording of the webinar. So if you need to show this to anybody else for any reason, you'll have that available to you. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and hope you have a great day and keep enjoying the summer break. Thank you.